Forget what the history books say about divine punishment. In 1348, London was not being punished. It was being consumed. A healthy human body took only 96 hours to transform into a mass of blackened tissue and lungs drowning in blood. Today we are opening the vault on the Black Death. Not to recite dates, but to perform a biological autopsy of the pathogen that nearly erased Europe from existence. I am Vane, and this is the forensic report they never taught you in school. The victim felt nothing. That is the first forensic detail you need to understand. On a summer afternoon in June 1348, a dock worker in the Port of London was bitten by a flea no larger than a grain of rice. He did not slap at it. He did not notice. The bite left no mark, no itch, no warning. But in that single moment, approximately 4,000 bacterial cells entered his bloodstream. Their name was Yersinia pestis, and they had just declared war on his immune system. This was not a random infection. This was a biological massacre engineered by evolution itself. The flea that bit him was infected with so many plague bacteria that its digestive system had been completely blocked. Imagine a tube packed so tightly with living organisms that nothing can pass through. The flea was starving, it's perpetually agonizingly hungry, despite feeding constantly. So it fed again, and again. But every time it bit into human skin, the blockage in its gut forced it to regurgitate the bacteria directly into the wound. It was vomiting death into the bloodstream with surgical precision. Dr. Alexandre Yersin identified this mechanism in 1894 while investigating a plague outbreak in Hong Kong. He discovered that the bacterium did not just infect the flea, it weaponized it. Modern electron microscopy has since confirmed what Yersin could only theorize. Yersinia pestis forms a dense biofilm inside the flea's proventriculus, the valve between its esophagus and stomach. This biofilm is so thick that it physically prevents blood from reaching the stomach. The flea becomes a living syringe, pumping plague directly into every host it touches. By the time our dock worker brushed the flea off his arm, the invasion had already begun. Within 6 hours, the bacteria reached his lymph nodes. These are the body's filtration stations, biological checkpoints designed to trap and destroy foreign invaders. Under normal circumstances, they work. A standard bacterial infection might involve a few hundred cells. The immune system detects them, surrounds them, and eliminates them before you ever feel a symptom. But Yersinia pestis does not arrive in hundreds, it arrives in thousands. And it multiplies at a rate that overwhelms every defense the human body evolved over millions of years. Here is what made this pathogen different from anything Europe had ever encountered. Yersinia pestis carries a protein called Yersinia outer protein, or YOP for short. This protein actively disables the immune cells that try to engulf and destroy bacteria. It is the biological equivalent of jamming the enemy's radar before an airstrike. White blood cells that should be attacking the infection are instead paralyzed, unable to respond. Meanwhile, the bacteria double their population every 2 hours. By the time the dock worker sat down for his evening meal, completely unaware that anything was wrong, the pathogen load in his lymph nodes had grown from 4,000 cells to over 30,000, and they were just getting started. The body did eventually respond. By midnight, 12 hours after the bite, his immune system finally recognized the scale of the invasion. His core temperature began to rise. A fever set in, not the mild warmth of a common cold, but a spiking, aggressive heat as the body attempted to cook the infection out of existence. He woke in the night drenched in sweat, shivering despite the summer heat, his heart racing. He assumed he had eaten something bad. He had no idea that his lymph nodes were already beginning to swell with the accumulation of dead immune cells, live bacteria, and the biological wreckage of a war his body was losing. By dawn of the second day, the invasion was no longer invisible. The pain was about to begin. The dock worker woke on the second morning and immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. There was a lump in his groin. It had not been there the day before. Now it was the size of a walnut, hard, hot to the touch, and radiating a pain so sharp it felt like his body was tearing itself apart from the inside. He pressed his fingers against it and nearly collapsed. That lump had a name in medieval records, the BUBO, and it was the signature of the plague. What he was feeling was not an infection spreading. It was his body's last stand. The lymph nodes in his groin, specifically the inguinal nodes, were the closest filtration stations to the flea bite on his leg. By now, over 2 million bacterial cells were concentrated in that single area. His immune system had flooded the site with white blood cells in a desperate attempt to contain the breach. But Yersinia pestis was destroying them faster than his bone marrow could produce replacements. The lymph nodes swelled with the accumulation of dead immune cells, live bacteria, plasma, and necrotic tissue, all trapped inside a membrane that was never designed to hold that much pressure. Within 12 hours, the bubo grew to the size of a chicken egg. The skin over it stretched tight and discolored. First red, then purple, then a mottled black-blue, as the blood vessels beneath ruptured under the pressure. Medieval physicians called this the God's token, because once it appeared, survival was nearly impossible. Modern pathology calls it acute lymphadenitis, with hemorrhagic necrosis. The translation is simple. The lymph node was rotting while the victim was still alive. The pain became unbearable. The fever spiked to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. His body was burning itself in a final attempt to kill the infection through heat. Chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence during the height of the plague in 1348, described victims who were lucid one moment and delirious the next, their minds melting under the metabolic inferno. The dock worker could no longer walk. The bubo in his groin was so swollen that any movement felt like a knife twisting inside him. He lay on his mattress, drenched in sweat that smelled faintly sweet. The scent of ketones released when the body begins to consume its own muscle for fuel. And then the bacteria breached the lymph node wall. They poured into his bloodstream in a flood, millions of cells spreading to every organ, every tissue, every corner of his body. He had entered the third day, and that was when the real horror began. The term Black Death is not a metaphor. It is a clinical diagnosis. And on the third day, the dock worker understood why. His fingers had turned black. Not bruised, not dirty. Black. The color of charcoal, of something burned beyond recognition. He stared at his hands in confusion, then terror, as the discoloration spread from his fingertips down toward his palms. His toes were the same. The tip of his nose. The edges of his lips. He was watching his own body die in sections while his heart still beat. This was acral necrosis, tissue death caused by the complete collapse of blood circulation to the extremities. And it is the signature image of plague that medieval Europe would never forget. Here is the mechanism. Once Yersinia pestis enters the bloodstream in massive numbers, it triggers a catastrophic immune response called septicemia. The body detects the bacterial invasion and releases a flood of inflammatory chemicals, cytokines, interleukins, clotting factors, in an attempt to isolate and destroy the pathogen. But the bacteria release their own toxins in response, and the two forces collide in what modern medicine calls a cytokine storm. The result is systemic inflammation so severe that blood vessels throughout the body begin to leak and clot simultaneously. The smallest blood vessels, the capillaries in the fingers, toes, nose, and ears, are the first to fail. Blood clots form inside them, blocking oxygen delivery to the tissue. Without oxygen, cells die. Without living cells, the tissue turns necrotic. And necrotic tissue turns black. Confirmed that this symptom appeared in over 60% of documented bubonic plague cases that progressed to septicemic plague. The victims were quite literally rotting alive. The dock worker's wife recoiled when she saw him. His face was no longer recognizable. The tissue around his nose had begun to collapse inward. His lips were cracked and blackened, peeling away in strips. He could no longer speak clearly and his tongue was swollen, his throat closing as the infection spread to his respiratory system. The fever had pushed past 105 degrees. His brain was cooking. Hallucinations set in. He saw shadows moving in the corners of the room. He heard voices calling his name. His body was shutting down one system at a time, and his mind was following. But the bacteria were not finished. They had one final target, and it would kill him in less than 24 hours. On the morning of the fourth day, the dock worker began to cough. And what came out was blood. Not droplets, not flecks. A thick, frothy stream of crimson mixed with mucus and air, a biological foam that poured from his mouth with every convulsion. This was pneumonic plague, the deadliest form of the disease, and it meant the bacteria had reached his lungs. He had hours left. Yersinia pestis does not stop at the lymph nodes or the bloodstream. Once it achieves septicemia, it colonizes every organ it encounters. The lungs, with their vast surface area and rich blood supply, become the perfect breeding ground. Within 12 hours of entering the pulmonary tissue, the bacteria multiply into the billions. They destroy the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen is transferred into the blood. The immune system responds by flooding the lungs with fluid in a desperate attempt to flush out the infection. But the fluid does not drain. It accumulates. And the victim begins to drown from the inside. Medieval physician Guy de Chauliac, who survived the plague in Avignon in 1348, documented this phase with horrifying precision. He wrote that victims in the final stage coughed continuously, expelling bloody sputum that stank of decay. He noted that they gasped for air like fish pulled from water, their lips turning blue, their chests heaving with the effort to pull oxygen into lungs that were no longer functional. Modern autopsies of plague victims from mass graves in London, conducted by the Museum of London Archaeology team in 2011, confirmed the presence of pulmonary edema and hemorrhagic pneumonia in skeletal remains. The lungs had filled with blood and literally burst under the pressure. The dockworker's breathing became shallow and rapid. His oxygen saturation plummeted. His heart raced, trying to compensate for the lack of oxygen reaching his brain. But there was no compensation possible. The tissue in his lungs was necrotic. The capillaries were clotted. The alveoli were flooded. Every breath was agony. Every cough brought more blood. His wife and children fled the room. They knew what this meant. Everyone in London knew. When the blood comes, death follows within hours. And then 96 hours after the flea bite, his body gave up. His heart stopped. His brain went dark. The infection had consumed him completely, from the inside out, organ by organ, cell by cell. He died on a straw mattress in a room that smelled of sweat, blood, and rot. And his body, covered in blackened tissue and oozing buboes, was dragged into the street and thrown onto a cart with dozens of others. No funeral, no burial. Just a pit outside the city walls where the dead were stacked like firewood and set ablaze. 4 days. That is all it took. But the real question is not how he died. The real question is why it does not happen anymore. What changed in 700 years? The biology of Yersinia pestis is identical. The bacteria that killed 25 million people in medieval Europe still exists today. The pathogen has not weakened. We simply got smarter. The answer is streptomycin. A single antibiotic discovered in 1943 can eliminate plague from the human body in 72 hours. A disease that once erased entire cities can now be cured with a 10-day course of pills. 4 days to death became 4 days to recovery. That is the only difference between medieval apocalypse and modern footnote. But here is what should stay with you. It only works if you understand what is killing you. The dockworker in 1348 had no concept of bacteria. He died because his world did not know what it was fighting. The Black Death proved that ignorance is more lethal than any microbe. A single-celled organism collapsed civilizations not because it was unstoppable, but because no one knew how to stop it. So the next time you take an antibiotic, understand what you are holding. It is the only thing standing between you and a medieval death. The vault has been opened, the autopsy is complete. I am Vane, and the case is closed. Now, if this forensic investigation gave you a new perspective on history, hit that subscribe button. This channel exists because you demand the scientific truth, not the sanitized version. Drop a comment telling me what disease or disaster we should dissect next. Your input shapes the next case I open. And smash that like button if you believe this story deserves to reach more people. The algorithm listens to you. The vault stays open as long as you keep it alive. I will see you in the next investigation.